Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to talk today. So I wish happy birthday to Ramki and wish him many happy returns of the day. So today I want to, so this is my title, Soup Norm of Holomorphic Single Cast Forms. And as we will see that this also concerns quite a lot with the Bergman kernel. So I also wrote that and bounds for the Bergman kernel. So this is a joint work with my PhD student, Hariram Krishna. Maybe we should see him at the end of my talk. Somebody should display him something. Okay, so we can start. So basically, let me give a short introduction or a gist of the talk. So this talk is concerned with the problem of estimation of soup norm of an L2 normalized holomorphic single cast form of degree n. N is anything you want, which is fixed, which is arbitrary but fixed. And in terms of the scalar weight, k, so k is an integer, and which is assumed to be large as compared to n. So let us see some notation, which some of which was already introduced yesterday. So here F is a single cast form of degree n on the single modular group, which we denote by gamma n, which is SPN Z, and the space of the holomorphic forms are denoted by SNK. Norm F2 is the Peterson norm, and when I say that something is L2 normalized, which I mean that Peterson norm is 1. Coordinates for a point on the single upper half plane will be Z usually, and write it as X plus IY. These are symmetric complex matrices, and Y is positive real matrices, and Y is positive definite. And the point of this talk is to look at the soup norm of F, and which is a finite quantity, and it is defined like this. So soup norm of F is just the usual supremum norm of the quantity, invariant quantity det y to the k over 2 times F, and you take the supremum over the or any fundamental domain actually, or you can just take the supremum over the whole single upper half plane. Value will be the same. It's a finite quantity, and of course doesn't depend on the choice of the fundamental domain, which and I reserve the notation script fn to be the Siegel's fundamental domain. So the quest for suitable upper bounds on the soup norm is the old and classical soup norm problem, which has its genesis is very old in the question of understanding the mass distribution of eigenfunctions on a complete Riemannian manifold of dimension d without boundary. There are several analysts or harmonic analysts who made significant contributions. Sager, Sauke, Schiffman, Zedlich, and are some notable names. But the situation of interest for us is obviously the arithmetic groups and arithmetic quotients, and for that Ivanich and Sarnak I think were the first to prove a result, which still stands today, I think. So I will just recall that result. So let phi be a mass AK eigenform of weight 0 on a co-compact discrete arithmetic subgroup. Basically, you can think of this as arising from the group of units of maximal order important algebra. And suppose it has eigenvalue lambda. So delta is the Laplace operator. And then the theorem is that for all epsilon positive, this soup norm is bounded by lambda to the 5 by 24 plus epsilon. So this is a landmark result, and I think all other investigations in this topic kind of stem from this result. Note that this beats the generic bound lambda to the 1/4 for phi on a compact Riemann surface. This is a general result. I forgot who was the one person who proved this, but this beats the generic result by a certain margin, fixed margin, maybe 1/24 or something. So this was a new result, and so this improvement was possible because there is an algebra of AQ operators and you can exploit that. So arithmetic plays a role. So I want to mention here the sup norm problem is really significant generally. For example, if one obtain lambda to the epsilon in this bound, then this will imply Lindelof for the central value for phi. This is known, I think, and the more better you can prove bounds for the sup norm, the better you can prove bounds for the subconvexity problem. Of course, I think the other methods that are used to prove subconvexity will give stronger results. Nevertheless, this is also one point to note. So this is a significant problem. So the question that we want to address today is to provide good information about the size of the sup norm of this quantity in terms of k. So for example, one can ask whether this object or this quantity grows polynomially with k. A priori it is not clear, even though I am told that perhaps, it's not certain, perhaps this follows from some generalities on automorphic forms. Probably somewhere it's there in the literature, maybe Brumley, Templier, somewhere, but yeah, nobody is certain. But yes, that's the question. It may be exponential, why not? Okay, so but it is expected to be polynomial. Yeah. So let us mention some results which are known in our setting. So for holomorphic Hecke eigenform on SF2Z, Zia was proved long back that the Peterson norm is very sharp bounds for the for the sup norm, and essentially it is like k to the 1/4. So the proof uses deep results on bounds on L1 sim squared due to Hopstein-Lockhart, and obviously the Fourier expansion. So there are certain other results available in the weight aspect in the holomorphic setting. That's our setup. So there's a result by Valentin Blumer about something like I think he considered Ikeda lifts and worked on SP2. Reznikov proved a result about mass real analytic mass forms of weight k. Blumer Paul looked at the compact, worked in the compact setting. For SP2, I came for mass forms, but in the compact setting. Cogdell-Luo looked at the quantum ergodicity conjecture for single modular forms, and we with Sengupta, he looked at this question for I think degree 2 single modular forms. Okay, so there's maybe many results when one goes to the level aspect or when one looks at other aspects, eigenvalue aspects, and so on. So I have not deliberately not included those references. It would be too long a list. So we just be content here with this, and probably we'll see more references as we go on. Okay, so the question basically, therefore, which we want to understand is what happens when we move to higher degrees, namely to SPN. I thought I will not give the answer, but the answer also got displayed. So the answer is the situation is very far from understood. And so for many various reasons, and part of it I think was discussed by Abhishek yesterday. So one hears serious roadblocks when one tries to move move towards higher degrees, and the Fourier expansion will not immediately give meaningful results because there is no easy normalization of single modular forms, unlike elliptic modular forms. For example, if you have an L2 normalized form, then the first coefficient can be handled. You can bound it by proportional to 1 over L1 sim square f, and you can put a handle on it, and then you can proceed. And that's how Zia did whatever he or she did. Such a thing is not possible here. One lands into deep conjectures. And, so, however, it's not completely hopeless. When n is bigger than 2, we can, however, use the Peterson trace formula to bound AFT, where AFT is a Fourier coefficient. So I just quickly glance through the notation that we will use here F is a single modular form, AFT is the Tth coefficient, and this Fourier expansion is indexed by n by n matrices, which I call lambda n, and these are the so-called half integral matrices. So the diagonals are integral and positive, and the off diagonal are half integral. So obviously, if you want to look at the Fourier expansion, you have to understand the behavior or the growth of this Fourier coefficients f of t by whichever means you can. So the Peterson formula, trace formula, will imply that when you sum over a basis, any orthonormal basis, and the set of fixed orthonormal basis will be denoted by b and k, which, if you want, you can take to be Hecke eigenforms, but it really doesn't help. So look at such a sum of the absolute square of the coefficients and up to a constant, it is the Tth coefficients of the Tth Poincare series, and is very well known. So this will lead to sums of matrix argument, Kloosterman sums and Bessel functions, and which are unfortunately intractable unless n is 2, which was done by a remarkable paper by Kitauka. I mean, this paper has been used thousands of times by thousands of authors, and I think it's worth mentioning that this is a remarkable paper. At present, of course, so this approach probably will not work well n is bigger than 2. It turns out that for obtaining a polynomial bound on the sup norm of f, we need we need bounds which are uniform in K, not only in the T. So T is the matrix, or if you think in terms of elliptic modular forms, this is the N, AFN. So not only you should need to know how it grows with respect to N, you also need to know how it behaves with respect to K, the other parameter. So you need a bound of this shape where alpha and beta are real parameters. So unfortunately, all known methods of bounding Fourier coefficients fail to give meaningful results, and the only hope seems to be this Peterson formula, which uses Poincare series, simply because we cannot control the dependence on K satisfactorily, which is crucial. For this problem. Okay. Whereas by the method of Poincare series, as we have just indicated, when n is at least 3, it is difficult. I think it's quite difficult to put one's hands on. So when n is at least 3, you are kind of in nowhere. So we need to get around this event to start utilizing the Fourier expansion. We do not really know what to do unless you get some bound of the form 1.4, equation 1.4, that's on the top. So our first job, therefore, will be to overcome this somehow, and that's what we do. So our first proposition would show the following actually a stronger, it's quite a stronger estimate. Namely, if you look at the sum of the absolute squares of the coefficients over a basis, and then you can also bound it in a similar shape. And so such a bound which was displayed in the last formula holds with some alpha and beta, and I will also give you the values of alpha and beta. Alpha is some quadratic, beta is also some negative quadratic. So basically you might be amused that beta is negative, so there is no saving, there is unsaving. So we are not really saving, we are making our life worse by getting this bound as det k by 2 plus gamma n. So yeah, it's worse than Hecke's bound, but it suffices for the problem at hand, and it gives some bounds for alpha and beta. Alpha is kind of still tractable, but beta is the problematic. So later on, I will show you how to improve this. I think we can now take beta to be 0 after all this work. But alpha will be worse. So basically, we know how to get Hecke's bound uniform in K. Okay, with a bound which is the power of K is not good, will not be good. Nevertheless, so this bound here, the beta that's related to Resnikov-Saldanha conjecture, which was discussed in some detail yesterday by Abhishek. So one can show that beta cannot be bigger than n+1/4 by looking at the Rankin-Selberg L series, and this guy has a pole at s equals to k. And so if you can easily check that wherever this guy converges in the half plane, that half plane has to be to the right of the pole, and that's how you get this. So and the bound is sharp. By sharp I means you cannot drop the epsilon. You cannot. One can do something about omega results and so on. So you cannot drop the epsilon either. And okay, so the proof of therefore this lemma 1.1, by which I mean these admissible values of alpha and beta. So that has to follow via the Bargmann kernel, which is basically the backbone of today's talk. So this guy basically saves our lives. And this object will be the focus of the rest of the talk. And these values of alpha and beta will follow from this equality, that when you basically Parseval and when you sum over a basis and look at the sum of mods with the Fourier coefficient square, exponential of a negative exponential, and involving t and y. And so this you can obtain by integrating the invariant functions mod 1. And so the integrand basically is the Bargmann kernel. Almost, this is just a slide of notation or language, which is essentially the Bargmann kernel that we will look at. So in our notation, this will be dkzz. So basically, you have to bound 1.7 to get a bound for 1.6. To bound 1.7, you have to understand what is the quantity in the box very closely, and that's what we are going to do. So before doing that, let us look at some conjectures about the sup norm in the Siegel setting of Siegel modular forms. So Valentin Blumer looked at the case of Cytokuro lifts, and based on some results obtained, speculated about the following conjecture on the size of Siegel-Hecke eigenforms, and also provided some support. Basically, the support came by several kinds of lifts. Either Ikeda lift or Cytokuro lift. So this is the conjecture that one probably will believe. It's really hard that if you have this L2 normalized Hecke eigenform, then at k is large, you have this. The sup norm should grow like k to the n into n+1/8 plus e to the power of 1. And this is not known, unfortunately, quite far from what we know. Several remarks follow. So this conjecture, as we will see, is consistent with the expected size of the Bargmann kernel, which is just below. We will see that. Assuming Lindelof for all quadratic twists of Hecke eigenforms of integral weights, Blumer could show that the upper bound in 2.1, when n is equal to 2, this we put n equals to 2, this becomes 3/4. This guy. So you could show the bound k to the power 3/4 by assuming the all the heavy conjectures, and that too for a Cytokuro lift, and not for an arbitrary, not for a non-lift, for a lift. So I think I have some work with Sengupta by using Fourier-Jacobi expansions, proving a slightly weaker result, but the approach probably was easier. So Blumer also shows that there exist certain forms which are basically Ikeda lifts, satisfying the lower bound, correct lower bounds with an epsilon, with the exception of k to the minus epsilon in the conjectural bound for the sup norm. So at least one knows that the bound, whatever it is tight. It cannot be improved because you have this lower bound. And also you have the correct upper bound in n equals to 2 when, but for lifts. This is kind of little mysterious. So next, let us move on to the certain conjectures on the Bargmann kernel. So recall that one expression for the Bargmann kernel would be very simple. It is just a sum over an orthonormal basis. in this fashion. You take G of Z and G of W bar, and where obviously this B and K is an orthonormal basis. And more intrinsically, you can express the Bergman kernel as a certain average over the group in this form, as you can see. And this A and K is a certain constant, which will be important for us. So here the slash action is with respect to the variable W. There are two variables here, Z and W. Both are in the upper half, physical upper half plane. And A and K is a certain constant, is a structural constant. It comes out from certain integrals and some local infinity computations. So it is a structural fixed constant coming from the theory, maybe given to us by maybe one of Siegel, Maas, or Klingen. One of them gave us this probably. And the size of this quantity is K to the N into N plus 1 by 2. And now this Bergman kernel, appears in the theory of automorphic functions in many connections. First of all, it's a reproducing kernel for the space of holomorphic cusp forms. And it is used in the theory of metrization, dimension formula, appears as the ratio of canonical hyperbolic matrix and the quotient. You can look at Kramer's works. He has a long list of works on these kind of topics. And basic properties have been studied in Cogdell-Luo, Klingen, so on. Look at this. And this Bergman kernel basically can also be employed to prove a version of arithmetic quantum unique ergodicity conjecture in compact sets on average, because Bergman kernel is an average. So we'll get a result on average. So I will not discuss this. So let us now move on to the central objects of study in this paper. Namely, you look at this object, Bergman kernel. By some abuse of notation, I will still continue to call this the Bergman kernel, even though it's really not. So you have put Z equal to W and multiplied by this det Y, but let's agree to still call this as the Bergman kernel. I don't have any new name for it. And okay, so from this, this is basically a sum of squares. So it is clear several, first of all, we should understand that this guy is invariant because it's a sum of invariant functions. It is bounded because each term is bounded because we're looking at cusp forms. And this bound, because we have summed over an orthonormal basis, but this bound should only depend on the space, underlying space, namely on N and K only. So basically one has to understand the size of this function. Moreover, there is a fairly known conjecture. You can look at Kramer's works, and this should also be known to complex geometers, I think, because they study the Bergman kernel quite closely, maybe on the unit disk model, but I think this issue should be fairly known. That with the above notation and setting, as K becomes large, this supremum of this quantity as Z varies on the upper of Siegel upper of plane should behave like K to the power this exponent 3n into n plus 1 by 4. And well, the impolite constant might depend on n, and and that's it. It's quite neat. And this notation, notation which I've written there just means that this is of the same order of magnitude. Maybe this is sandwiched between two multiples of this exponent. So basically, the size of this sup norm is given by this exponent of K. In particular, it's polynomial. So the exponent also equals 3 by 2 times the complex dimension of the Siegel modular variety, and this should be of interest to complex geometers. They should view it in this fashion. And such bounds are usually obtained by detailed analysis of the corresponding heat kernel, basically by the spectral expansions. And this is the point of view of a long list of papers by Kramer and his collaborators in school. So that basically granting this conjecture, therefore one would obtain, if you by dropping all but one term, you'll get a bound for the sup norm, right? It is a sum of squares, and you just drop and take square root, and therefore you will get the sup norm of any L2 normalized Siegel modular form, which is bounded by K to the power 3n into n plus 1 by 8. This is expected. And basically, yes, so the point that I made when I discussed Palomar's result is that the conjectural bound, which was kind of put forward by Palomar, that this sup norm is bounded by k to the n in 10 plus 1 by 8, now fits with 2.1, basically, namely, if you square this, it will be n into n plus 1 by 4, and then you multiply it by the dimension, which is n into n plus 1 by 2. So we'll get 3n into n plus 1 by 4, which is exactly this exponent which is appearing. So on average, therefore, the conjecture on the Bergman kernel is consistent with the individual bounds. Okay. So when n is equal to 1, this conjecture is actually known from the works, actually a long list of works by Jorgensen, Kramer, Friedman, and other people by the heat kernel method, and also it's known in the case of Hilbert-Modular forms. But perhaps I think for the lower bounds, I think there's an epsilon defect. I think the lower bound looks like k to the 3 by 2 minus epsilon, whereas it is expected that it should be just k to the 3 by 2. And it also follows from Zia's results. You know, this she had result that the sup norm in the weight k set to z was like k to the 1/4 plus or minus epsilon. So if you square it and add it up, you'll still get a defect plus minus epsilon, but still you will get the same. The quality of the bound will be good basically. Right? You will get the exponent 3 by 2. So we obtain the following result. This is the main result of today's talk. So if fix an epsilon, put this L of n to be this exponent in the conjecture of for the Bergman kernel, 3n into n plus 1 by 4, and suppose k is even. Even though I think one can remove this restriction that k is even. It's for convenience. So with the above notation and setting, the sup norm for the Bergman kernel for n equals to 1, it matches. For n equals to 2, it also matches up to the epsilon. Seems to be a problem there. So the lower bound matches for all n basically, so k to the power ln, and the upper bound here is a little worse. I think it's something 5 by 3 ln minus something. Okay, so therefore when n equals to 1 and 2, the opposite two sets of inequalities prove the conjecture on the growth or the size of this Bergman kernel. And up to the epsilon in the upper bound when it equals to 2, and obviously also improving the k to the epsilon from Kramer's works when n equals to 1, and obviously the lower bounds are fine. And towards the sup norm, therefore we will have the following: you drop all but one terms and take square root, and therefore we will get that the sup norm of an individual L2 normalized Siegel form of is bounded by k to the n over k to the 9 over 4 when n equals to 2, and by this when n is at least 3. So at least its polynomial is quadratic, and I will discuss the relation of this bound with the conjectural bound later. So for obviously, if not, doesn't have to be a Hecke eigenform, we just summed over any orthonormal basis. And since the dimension grows like this, k to the n into n plus 1 over 2, you can easily write down this following corollaries. So for k large enough, there exists a normalized or L2 normalized F1 whose sup norm is at least k to the n into n plus 1 by 2, n into n plus 1 by 8 without any epsilon. So this slightly improves Blomer's bound, who had a minus epsilon. And okay, and when n is equal to 2, you can do a slightly better. So if you look at just the sum, if you just sift out the Cytokuro lifts, so that's basically the expression. The star means we are just summing over a basis of non-lifts, things which are orthogonal to the space of Cytokuro lifts. Then the following corollary shows that the bulk of the contribution in for the sup norm comes from the non-lifts, as basically one should expect. So one has this BKZ star is sandwiched between bounds of the same order, k to the n by 2 up to the epsilon on the upper bound, and so therefore this will also imply that there exists an F2 whose sup norm norm is at least k to the 3 quarters. And how do you prove this? Well, upper bound is trivial because it's this smaller sum. So upper bound is trivial. The lower bound will follow by throwing away the cytochroma lifts and showing that their contribution doesn't matter. Indeed, you can show that the contribution is at most k to the 7 over 2 plus epsilon, which is smaller than 9 over 2. And so you can just throw it out. This can be seen from various means. From the best possible values, if you use best possible values for central values of L functions and plug it in the Fourier expansion of a cytochroma lift, you can do this. I think this is done in one of papers, Sengupta, and you could have also used the bound which you got by Fourier Jacobi expansion. So both would work. So basically, the cytochroma lifts do not contribute much. So the main contribution comes from non-lifts. So therefore, there is a non-lift, non-cytochroma. So this F2 is not a lift. It's given. It's guaranteed that it's not a cytochroma lift. Yet its sup norm is big, as big as possible. Okay. So when n equals to 1, our lower bound gives k to the 3 over 2 without the epsilon. And the main point is that we show how to obtain this upper bound without any recourse to techniques involving the hit kernel methods or using the Hofstee-Lockhart bound for upper and lower bounds for Fourier coefficients, the first Fourier coefficients. So what we do is we just try to use as minimal hypothesis as possible. We just use trivial bounds for Kloosterman sums and Bessel functions, and basically the argument hinges on counting certain points on gamma 1. Basically, you have to count this kind of things, which is a very common thing while dealing with the supernorm problem. And the purpose of this exercise is to demonstrate that with such minimal hypothesis, the proof might generalize to higher degrees. And this seems to be a prospect still to be cultivated enough. But I make a remark that this theorem probably holds for a fixed congruence subgroup as it is expected, but I think some work is necessary because for other congruence subgroups there are some issues about fundamental domain and so on. Okay, so now I will briefly discuss or make some remarks really about the proof of the main theorem about the size of the Bergman kernel. As you have seen, I might suspect that the lower bound is easy because we kind of got the lower bound for every degree, and indeed it is. So the first of all, one has to make this observation. I think this is crucial. That the sup norm. Look at this. So one has to prove this inequality, which is not difficult, but yet it needs some observation that. Basically, you can compare the sup norm with this particular summation, sum over orthogonal basis of squares of coefficients at the identity matrix is 1, n is just the identity n cross n matrix. And you could have taken any t, basically any fixed t naught, but this is probably the most convenient. And this is true, this inequality is true for all y naught. So you just have to choose your y naught carefully and observe that this sum of squares of coefficients at identity is bounded away from 0 up to constant c and k inverse, which I forgot to write. It's a certain ratios of gamma factors or something like that. It's explicit times the coefficients first coefficient of the Poincare series, which you can show that is bounded away from 0. I think it's bigger than I don't know, 1 or 2 or something. It's absolutely, and this follows when k is large enough. This follows by a result of Saha-Kowalski-Zimmermann asymptotic orthogonality of Fourier coefficients. And of course, you have to choose your y properly and plug in the choice of y here and simplify. And I think what I have written, the lower bound drops out. So the main problem, therefore, is to look at the upper bound, and to prove the upper bound, as is well known, we will use actually we have to combine two kinds of estimates. When you are high in the cusp, you should look at the Fourier expansion. When you are near to the boundary at the bottom, you should look at the Bergman kernel. This is quite classical. So first, I will treat the Fourier expansion. So we already kind of indicated how to overcome the interactability of Fourier expansion, namely through the Bergman kernel. So now we mention one unconditional bound that one gets out of it. So we have the following theorem. So for Z in the fundamental domain, the Siegel's fundamental domain, and for any epsilon small, the square root of the Bergman kernel is bounded by this right-hand side. It's quite explicit, k to the n by det y power something, and this gamma n comes up. Remember, this is just a polynomial, quadratic polynomial in n times k to the power some exponent, which is also quadratic, and times something very small. It's kind of sub-exponential. I think some people call it sub-exponential, not really exponential decay, but almost like exponential decay. And furthermore, if the largest diagonal entry, which I denote by y, largest diagonal entry of capital Y of the imaginary part, suppose it is yn, and if it is bounded below by a certain multiple of k, we have to carefully choose these constants, then you actually will have exponential decay. So basically, yeah, so that's how. So after a while, it decays exponentially. Actually, there is a version of this theorem valid for the whole Siegel upper half plane, and not only in the fundamental domain. I think it's valid for all Hn. There is a version with a slightly weaker exponent. I think, if I remember correctly, this should be n plus 1 over 2 instead of n plus 1 over 4. If one tries to write same bound over value, which is valid over the whole Siegel upper half plane. And that perhaps I think is useful in some occasions. And so basically so we will use this theorem only to obtain a certain cutoff region, roughly of the form that y bigger than k to the n, with Fn the fundamental domain. And then we will just be happy with the exponential decay there. This is not really the general strategy, but you have to make a cutoff somewhere in between. But unfortunately, we cannot do this. Our hands are tired. So hence we appeal to the exponential decay. Generally, it's not done in this way. Generally, we have more room to work with, and we have to make cutoff suitably and balance the contributions from Fourier expansion and Bergman kernel. So here, the one side of the balance is already kind of heavy, so we cannot do anything else with it. And so also this bound most likely will have other applications. For n equals to 2, of course, the Fourier expansion can be handled somewhat better, and I will keep on indicating this throughout, if whenever possible. And the proof of the theorem 4.1 rests on the fact that this is a very useful fact that for any degree, only finitely many Fourier coefficients contribute to the mass of f, namely to the supernorm, to the size of f. Only finitely many coefficients significantly contribute. So you have to control the size of the set of Fourier coefficients, which make this bulk of the contribution. And this estimate of this set can be done in a better way when n equals to 2, and even better than what is mentioned in theorem 4.1. Which is valid, however, for all n. Okay, so this is how one should go about it. Just somehow put your hands on a certain finitely many Fourier coefficients, which will make the bulk of the contribution, and then just try to study closely their contribution. So if you look at the Bergman kernel, of course, this is the main heart of the work. So looking at the Bergman kernel, so basically, therefore, as we have, as indicated before, we just have to look at the size of the Bergman kernel in the complementary region, which would mean that when det y is bounded by k to the n, which is basically a compact region. And basically, we prove towards this the following theorem. This for z in the fundamental domain, the Bergman kernel is bounded by this expression, which is again it's essentially it's k to the power quadratic times det y to the power linear. That's how probably you should read it. And here y1 is the smallest diagonal entry of y. And I think we also have a version which is valid for the whole Siegel upper half plane, but I forgot to write it. So the main theorem therefore would follow from the above theorem if we work in the compact region det y less than k to the n. So you have to just plug in det y less than k to the n, and whatever drops out will be the answer. Of course, you have to, I think the presence of this y1 will facilitate in improving the bound by a small amount. But you can ignore this y1 and still you will get some bound. Okay, so this theorem has other, this theorem is probably the backbone of the whole work, because even to start with, you needed some values of admissible values of alpha and beta. Basically, when you want to bound this mean square of this Fourier coefficients, so you needed these values of alpha and beta even to start with. So that starting, or this initial alpha and beta, is supplied by this theorem 4.2, because this gives a bound for the Bergman kernel. And if by Parseval, we had reduced the problem to a bound for the Bergman kernel, and you just have to plug in and still have to do some work, because this is only a bound in the fundamental domain, and you have to translate the bound to the whole single upper half plane. And in this case, it's not that easy. One has to do some work. And yes, and the values of alpha and beta that I displayed in one of the lemmas, in the early lemmas, that will drop out from that kind of calculation. But if suppose if we estimated this p of t, I forgot to define this p of t is this quantity, this mean square, sum of squares of coefficients over a orthonormal basis without the half, just the sum of squares is denoted by p of t. I forgot to define it, but if you estimate this p of t just by bounding the coefficients of Poincare series, then you will get from the structural constants, it's given to you, as I said, by one of Siegel, Maas, or Klingen, I don't remember, that alpha will be given to you to be 3n square plus n plus 8. So the only question will be about beta, and so beta equal to 0 will give Hecke's bound. So suppose you have Hecke's bound with this alpha, which is is given to you, then if you try to work out whatever we have done, you will get this bound. You will get this, that the Bergman kernel is bounded by k to the power 19 by 20 times n into n plus 1, which is, I think, 0.85. 19 by 20 is 0.85, and the conjectural bound for the Bergman kernel is 3 by 4 times n plus 1, which is 3 by 4 is, I think, 0.75. So it's 0.75 versus 0.85, not that bad. And of course, currently what we have is 5 by 4 times n plus 1, and 5 by 4 is something like 1.25, it's slightly worse. And so probably there is some hope. And as I said, probably I will not have an occasion to mention this later. Our method now can show that beta, you can take beta equal to 0, but this value of alpha will not be this, it will be worse, and that messes up things. Okay, so well, you can now make a statement about the general value of beta, which can vary in this range from 0 to n plus 1 over 4, and you can interpolate various bounds and you can get to this, and you can check that if you put beta equals to n plus 1 over 4, which is the best possible value of beta predicted by the Resnikov-Saldanha conjecture, which is basically out of reach at the moment, and if you put beta equals to that, then you will get the conjectural upper bound k to the power 3n into n plus 1 over 8 for the Bergman kernel, and therefore you will prove the conjecture. But it is contingent on this best value for beta, and you just have to use the Fourier expansion alone. You do not need the Bergman kernel in that case. You just have to use the Fourier expansion and you will get it, but at the cost, the price is you have to pay is heavy. You have to prove this conjecture, Resnikov-Saldanha conjecture, which probably is very difficult. Okay, but there is no need to lose hope, because this is just by using the Fourier expansion alone. In practice, you should also take help from the Bergman kernel. Okay, so I think my time is also almost up. So I just very briefly indicate the proof. Well, for the proof, you need to use this expression for the Bergman kernel, which was the sum over the group. So you have to split the sum into 3 parts, one over the unipotent elements. So these are essentially parameterized by the symmetric matrices, and the other sum will be over GL and Z, which is the most difficult, and the other sum will be over co-prime symmetric pairs. So we have to be very careful, because we are trying to prove a bound whose upper and lower bounds are the same. So you have to be, in each step, you have to be correct. Otherwise, things will mess up. So the bound for the symmetric matrices is just Lifshitz formula, but one has to. So we have a novel way to do this. I think through the Fourier expansion. I think this was not done before. At least this uniformity in K was not present before. And the sum 2 is over the GLN unimodular matrices, which is the most delicate part. And so we have a bound like this in terms of y and y tilde, which are positive definite, and also in terms of the smallest eigenvalue lambda 1 of y. And the sum 3 is basically reduces to a measurement of the classical Siegel-Eisenstein series, which is absolutely convergent for k bigger than n plus 1. And this is crucial. I make a joke that if somebody proved that if k this Siegel-Eisenstein series was convergent for not k bigger than n plus 1 but n plus 100, then everything will break down. Then we could not have proved the conjecture when n equals to 2 even. So this is crucial. This is not junk. So I also want us to check that the measurement can be bounded independent of y. That can be done because we are in the fundamental domain, needs some argument. So when n equals to 2, the proof is very delicate. I do not have time to discuss it. So we make good use of the knowledge of Fourier coefficients of Siegel-Poincare series of degree 2, which is, thanks to Kitaoka's work, is quite in a good shape. And basically, with a finer analysis of the counting function that supports the mass in the Fourier expansion. So I just display this diagram. So this orange, this blue line is the Fourier bound from the Fourier expansion that we get, and the Bergman kernel is is represented by this orange or red line. I think I see it as red. So basically, so this highest point here is 4.5. You can see. And here also it's 4.5. So 4.5 is 9/2, and 9/2 is the bound. This straight line, this dotted line is the 9/2 line. And so you have to traverse the path coming from here, reach the 9/2, and then it will go down, and again it will increase, and then it will exponentially decay. So that's the kind of the picture here. Obviously, we are bound. We are so on the horizontal thing, we are bounded log of det y with base k. So basically, we are looking at powers. We are linearizing the problem by taking log. We are because all our exponents are polynomial in k, and in this side, this is log of the Bergman kernel. Okay, so I think I have overshot my time, so I think I can finish it 1 minute. So there is also some work one can do for compact sets. So previously, what we did was on the whole fundamental domain, which is non-compact. One can look at compact sets, and basically Cogdell and Liu has shown that over a compact set, there is still an asymptotic formula one can prove for the Bergman kernel. Of course, the implied constants will now depend heavily on the chosen compact set. And the bound here, so the Bergman kernel will basically behave like the dimension k to the n into n plus 1/2 over a compact set. Any fixed compact set not depending on k. And the question is, when can f take large values in omega? Well, the answer is expected to be no. From 5.2, we see that f is approximately 1 on average, because you can look at this. The dimension is k to the n into n plus 1/2, and the size is also that, which is the sum over a basis. So basically, essentially, each term is approximately on average 1. But on the other hand, just by looking at the individual bound, it just gives k to the n into n plus 1/4. So when n equals to 2, you can use amplification by slightly improve it. So you can improve it to k to the power 3/2 minus eta for some absolute constant eta. So this can be done, but it's still technical. One has to overcome technical details. And so I just end by some concluding remarks. Basically, this first remark shows that the Bergman kernel, the supremum is attained at a point which is high in the cusp, which is represented by this inequality, that the imaginary part will have to be quite large. This is also supported by heuristics and compact sets. The best possible bound still falls short of the individual supremum that we have discussed. And our unconditional bound is 5/3 times the conjectural bound. So there is some hope probably of improving this, maybe for a Hecke eigenform. One can ask level aspect results, which is work in progress. One can also try to follow a Jacobi-Fried, or not Fried, but Fried, Jacobi-Fried approach to the whole problem. This is also some consideration. One can work out the result for a fixed congruence subgroup with in the case still in the K aspect, this will be good to have, will not be trivial. Over compact sets, one might be able to improve the result by strengthening the amplifier. The amplifier is basically constructed by Valentin Blumer and Ankit Paul in one of their papers. And it's, I think the amplifier is weak. It's obtained by putting absolute values. But I think one can, probably one can improve this, but things are very complicated. One should think about vector valued physical transforms, obviously. And the this will be difficult because I don't think there is a good theory of Poincare series or something. And the method should work quite generally for other groups in the weight aspect. This is also worth looking at. So with this, I think I will end whatever I had to say. I'm very sorry for I think taking some extra time. So I think I will stop here. So thank you very much for your attention, and again wish to like to wish Ramki very happy birthday and best wishes to him. So thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful talk. So now it's time for questions. So are there any questions or comments from the audience?
One question I have. Yes. So, like, how strong is this assumption of having that the Peterson norm?
Sorry, I cannot hear your voice.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, how strong is this assumption of having the Peterson norm to be 1? Because we can have the lower bound in terms of k on the Peterson norm itself, and sometimes it pops up in the denominator when we use.
Such things are not known in the Forstigal modular forms.
Yes. Oh, okay.
So that's hopeless. That's not known. Everything is conjectural, unfortunately. So we can.
Yeah.
I think the only way to normalize it is just by putting the Peterson norm to 1.
Okay. Yeah. So these things are not known. The L2 norm bounds are not known. So we put the assumption simply.
Yes.
Simplify things.
We do not have good handle over the L2 norms.
Yeah. Okay.
I think things are not known on average. When you sum over a basis, I think it can be expressed by some L functions or something. On average, you know what it is, but not for an individual form.
Yes. Okay. What was the notation in 1.7 x mod 1 set?
So basically, each entry of x varies between 0 and 1. Or an interval of length 1.
So are there any more questions? Okay. If not, then let's thank the speaker again.